story of a disaster like no other. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it rained 7.5 million tons of debris onto Pompeii. It sealed the fate of more than 1,000 people, but it also sealed the city in. Preserved it, protected it. Like nowhere else on Earth, the rediscovered Pompeii gives us access to the ancient world. And now, with new findings and new insights, we can tell the story of the ordinary people caught up in this disaster. These are the forgotten men and women who lived when Rome ruled, and were buried when the volcano blew. AD 79. As many as 20,000 people live in Pompeii, and for them, it's boom time. Their town is 150 miles from Rome, 3 miles from a benign little hill called Vesuvius. And it sits on the Bay of Naples, both a trade hub and a holiday playground. The people who live here have no idea what's about to hit. How death is coming to many of them. How within 48 hours their town will become both a tomb and a time capsule. For more than 200 years, archaeologists have been digging at Pompeii. Because of what happened here, the way whole districts of the town were perfectly preserved in the moment of their destruction, it shows like no other site how the people of ancient Rome lived their lives. Often, works focused on the rich and the powerful. The most eye-catching finds, furniture, works of art, even whole buildings, offer a glimpse of the top level of Roman society. But now one team is looking at a different group of Pompeians. People who've often been overlooked. The blue-collar workers, the ordinary men and women who don't belong to the elite.
We've got a whole suite here of working class properties, houses and shops and workshops and all the bits and pieces that made up a working class zone in Pompeii. This has given us a fantastic and unique opportunity to look at the lives of the other 98% of the population who've been largely hidden from us for so long now.
This block's made up of stores and workshops, which are also people's homes. And the aim of the work here is to build a picture of who those people were. With this particular building, it's even been possible to name the occupant. A single find unlocks the man's story.
It came from this storage niche down the corner of this room, which would have been next to a bed here. And what was found was a small bronze military diploma, which was a document given to a person upon retirement from the Roman military service.
Now kept under lock and key, the document amounts to a full resume. Because it's made of bronze rather than paper, it survived, still legible to this day.
It's a really important document because it establishes that the holder is a Roman citizen. His name down here is Marcus, son of Dama, Cyrus Garasenus. Garasenus. That's a really weird Roman name. It doesn't sound like a Roman name. And it's because he's a Syrian. As are all his mates who have signed at the back. 3 of them come from Antioch, 1 of them comes from Caesarea, and so on. And this guy has served in the fleet at Misenum, it says. Fantastic. Misenum is just over the water from Pompeii. They're essentially the police force that keeps the Mediterranean free of pirates. So he probably didn't see terribly much action, except just being a presence there in the Mediterranean, going out on their ships, visiting various ports, making sure that no one was up to trouble.
So Garasinus is a veteran of the Marines, a force made of non-citizens. Roman citizenship was the reward for 26 years' service, and its proof is the diploma. No wonder he kept it close.
This is like your passport. It's the most valuable thing you have. It's more than your passport. It's your birth certificate and your passport put together. And he keeps it in the safest place he knows. And so we can be pretty sure that he's the name of the guy who was sleeping in that bed in 1879.
So this man is a respected member of the community, and he's made a new life for himself as a tradesman. The building houses a workshop, and here he produces bronze goods for sale.
When the first excavators came here in the 1870s, they found a whole series of bronze artefacts that were sold from here. What we've since done is excavated in some of the rooms out the back and some of the rooms out the front and found all the different bronze smithing facilities that helped to do that.
Early on the 23rd of August, AD 79, Garasinus is amongst his tools and his pots. The sun sets the rhythm of the day in the ancient world, and as soon as there's enough light, work begins. Up and down the street, other businesses are opening up.
But what you would have seen here in AD 79 is a street front teeming with wide entranceways into shops and workshops. But we've also found a series of stairwells that led up to second floor apartments above. Up there we can imagine hanging balconies that would have reached out over the street as well.
When the eruption comes, many of these upper stories will collapse under the weight of the debris. But today, in the building next door to Garasinus, a family starts its day. Archaeologists have determined that the business here is a restaurant.
In this threshold here, there's a double door which opened up from the centre here, and so the guest could come to the front here and look straight down the centre of the property into a dining room up the far end. So one of the clues that this building was operating as a restaurant in antiquity was found in this room in here. In the corner of this space we have an oven with a counter in front of it. We also found many coins in this space. These give us a fantastic indication of just how much money was changing hands in this kitchen.
It's a diner. There are many like it across the Roman Empire. Simple, relying on regular customers, passing trade at long hours. Within 48 hours, all they have will be gone. But for now, everyone has their job to do. And the streets are coming to life. The block's exclusively working class, but the street is a melting pot. Rich, poor, all trades, all races. The people of Pompeii are packed tight inside the city walls, and their lives all interconnect. In fact, the first business of the day is the coming together of people of different status. Our humble restaurant owner, also the head of his household, leaves his family to their chores and walks the short distance to the house of one of his neighbors. It's only a couple of streets, but it's a world away from his own home. This is one of the most important addresses in the city, and the buildings a very public display of wealth, power, and status.
house like this is built to stun the visitor. First with the view that you get as you come in through the narrow entranceway, and it opens out into this great space, the atrium. And you look through the broad tablinum and through to the garden, the peristyle garden there. And it's all using a standard Roman formula. The atrium is built typically with the roof sloping into the centre so that the water comes into a pool where it's connected and goes down to the well, and the light, of course, comes in here.
This house takes up the same space as the entire working class block 2 streets away. And every morning, outside its door, the ritual's the same. The local men form a line. They're here to make a formal gesture of respect.
And here is the tablinum, which is the traditional morning reception room of the house. Here, traditionally, the owner of the house is meant to sit perhaps on a throne, and you can see what an impressive position it'll be. He's framed in this space, and the visitor coming in looks through and sees him with a bright light behind him too. A stunning sight.
The owner of the house, Pompeii, is a patron. A godfather figure to his clients, he safeguards their interest, gives them advice, even money, in return for their respect and their loyalty. Their daily morning ritual is called the salutatio.
The theory is that after the salutatio, you set out to the forum, and the crowd that is gathered around you will then accompany you to the forum where, as a magistrate, you will give justice or whatever. And it's that retinue following you through the streets that's the sign of your importance. Big people never move alone. We've always got a crowd around them.
Life in Pompeii seems ordered, stable. But as Pompeius and his retinue make their way through the crowd, something else is happening. Miles beneath the surface of the earth, a terrible pressure is building. These people will soon learn that nothing is safe, not even the ground under their feet. Today, volcanology is a science. Experts try to predict eruptions by monitoring emissions. They plot changes in surface temperature and subterranean vibrations. Of course, the Romans of Pompeii have none of this. Few are concerned that their hill, Vesuvius, is a volcano.
Nowadays, if we look to the volcano behind me, we can see a very deep crater. This deep crater tells us of the recent eruption of Vesuvius. When the people of Pompeii would look towards the mountain, they could see a mountain with very lush vegetation, full of flowering trees and orchards that didn't give the impression of being an active volcano.
What the townspeople and the shepherds who graze their flocks on the side of the mountain don't know is that far beneath them, a catastrophic chain of events has begun.
If we could see deep under our feet, we could see that under this volcano, at 10-15 kilometers of depth, there is a magma chamber. The magma chamber is a space deep underground filled with molten rock at a temperature of around 1000 degrees Celsius. An extra amount of magma entered the magma chamber, in this case creating a higher pressure that forced a crack in the rocks above.
The molten rock is forcing its way out. In fact, its effects have already been felt some years before. The people of the city have lived through something which today would be seen as a terrible warning.
This is evidence of a major disaster, an earthquake that hit this city in 62 AD, just 17 years before the final eruption, what we find is that in this wall, for example, where we have the brick in the corner which surrounds this nice diamond-shaped wall, in fact is broken off at this point and is instead replaced by a much more poorly built wall. So the walls have been rebuilt with that rubble into this much more basic design.
Questo terremoto avvenuto nel 62 d.C., anche se i pompeiani non lo sapevano,
Even though the people on Pompeii did not know, it is clear to volcanologists today that this earthquake of 62 BC was a precursor of the eruption. It indicates that the magma is about to reach the surface and that the new eruption is about to occur.
una nuova eruzione sarebbe presto avvenuta.
And so it unfolds. The 17 years between the earthquake and the final eruption are, on a geological scale, just the blink of an eye. But the Romans don't see the world that way. To them, a natural disaster is the action of an angry god. So instead of being able to take the warning and abandon a city that is already doomed, the people of Pompeii do the opposite. They try to appease their gods by remaking the temples of the fallen, the town's main public space, bigger and grander than before. It's a demonstration of pride and prosperity. Clad in white marble, on the eve of the eruption it must appear indestructible. "2,000 years later, and in ruins, the Forum is now the focus of a startling piece of research. For decades, archaeologists have puzzled over this building. It's one of the largest here, but no one has ever determined what it was for.
We're standing in some kind of colonnaded porch with a special feature which is a raised platform, the sort of space which could be used for giving speeches, making public announcements, and almost certainly for auctions. The question is, what was actually auctioned here?
Whatever it was clearly something of value. Slots in the threshold stones indicate that the doors could be barred. There are also 2 guardhouses just inside. This was one of the most secure buildings in the city. It appears that the merchandise itself was kept in a long enclosed corridor, whose only windows opened onto an internal courtyard.
Again, the holes in the windowsills show that there were shutters that could bar the space. And over here, there's even a hole in the wall that might suggest a bar. Now this has led various people to suggest that what was in there was jewelry or something that needed to be guarded, but this is an odd way to look at jewels. This isn't a counter, this is a windowsill. So what I actually think was one of the functions of this corridor was the display of slaves for sale.
Slaves. This building suggests a part of the Roman world that's been largely invisible. Slaves are everywhere in ancient Rome. Households, businesses, even government. They make up 30% of Italy's population, and yet because the Romans treat them as a commodity rather than as people, we're left with virtually no written accounts of their lives. The story has been pieced together from the archaeological evidence, and that suggests that this building was a marketplace for human livestock. It was set up to handle shipments of slaves, often transported from the fringes of the empire. They were held and sold in this space.
They were probably given a drink and maybe washed off at the fountain. They were brought up the ramp that leads directly into this crypta, and then the buyers were able to look at them, examine them through these windows at a safe distance, but close enough to see whether there are any defects. And then, one by one, they were brought outside to the auction block to be sold.
The auction is a defining moment for a slave. It can be the difference between a relatively comfortable existence and a hellish one. And yet whoever buys him, his life is not his own. When the eruption comes, some slaves will die still chained. This man will be found where he fell, unable to run away. The ash from Mount Vesuvius smothered more of Pompeii than its buildings. It captured people, fleeing, cowering, dying in the face of an unfolding disaster. As the ash hardened and solidified, it held the shape of its victims' bodies, long after their flesh had gone. Archaeologists found cavities that they could fill with plaster and use to create molds. They were able to see, centuries on, exactly how the dead lay when the full force of the volcano struck. They also found bones. So far, the remains of 1,100 people have been pulled from the ground. But one find is different from the others, because of what was discovered next to the body.
Quando abbiamo eseguito il nostro scavo, abbiamo rinvenuto.
When we excavated, we found the shackles. There are 2 of them, so both ankles would have been locked up inside the big iron rings.
Al momento in cui abbiamo rinvenuto questi 2 particolarissimi oggetti,
when we found these 2 objects, we definitely knew that the first skeleton we found was a slave.
il primo scheletro che abbiamo rinvenuto apparteneva appunto ad uno schiavo.
Because he's a slave, he has no identity, no history beyond what's written in these bones.
Individual number 1 is a male. We can see that by looking at these brow ridges on his skull. He also has several features of his pelvis which also indicate that he's a male. He was between 5'6" and 5'9" tall. He was very young when he died, probably between 20 and 25. His collarbone hasn't completed developing, as has the upper parts of his pelvis.
Certain bones continue to develop even after a person appears to have stopped growing. The fact that his collarbones haven't fused says that this man was in the prime of life.
This individual has no signs of malnutrition or deficiency in their diet. He has no holes in his teeth. So this individual appears to have been reasonably healthy.
And the only reason we know anything about him is down to the manner of his death. His body was found with that of another, older man.
And what sort of building were they in?
Yeah, we found them near a tower, and they were escaping during the eruption.
To the trained eye of a forensic anthropologist, the state of the bones even 2,000 years after death is very telling.
On skeleton number 2, we have a lot of evidence of exposure to some kind of heat. On this vertebra particularly, you can see charring on the front. And that happens on a number of these vertebrae here. And on the foot bone here, again, you can see charring on the inside of the bone, which indicates the bone fractured as well.
It takes tremendous heat to cause damage like this.
The black colour indicates that the bones were exposed to a heat of between 300 and 600 degrees Celsius. That's between about 600 and 1100 Fahrenheit.
The evidence says that this heat came in a sudden, intense blast.
And we can see that the bodies were in what's known as a pugilistic pose, which is a boxer's pose. This is caused because the muscles begin to shrink when exposed to extreme heat. Now, the muscles that you use to clench everything and tighten everything are stronger than the ones that you use to stretch everything out. So as they shrink, those muscles take over and you adopt this stance. That would indicate that the individual died a very short period before being exposed to those temperatures. Because if the individual has gone into what's known as rigor mortis and gone stiff, they won't go into this pugilistic pose.
Time and again at Pompeii, archaeologists have found bodies posed in this way. Men and women killed by something they just couldn't outrun. As Pompeii's last day of normality draws to a close, the warning signs start to appear. Though the citizens have no idea what is about to happen, the world starts to change before their eyes.
Il giorno prima dell'eruzione il magma si muove verso la superficie. Durante la risata.
The day before the eruption, the magma rises towards the surface. During this process, the magma goes in between cracks in the rocks, and the rise of the magma itself creates a physical mutation of the volcano. The volcano grows in height, and the external slopes start tilting more, and the coastline moves slightly further away. All these factors can also be noticed by the people of Pompeii.
Potevano essere notate anche dagli abitanti di Pompei.
If people don't notice the altered shape of the mountain, or the drop in sea level, they must feel the ground beneath their feet begin to shift. Unfortunately, according to contemporary Roman accounts, this region is used to earth tremors. The Pompeians see them as a fact of everyday life, rather than a cause for alarm. So they carry on. For most, the working day which began at sunrise is over. Now the city eats. In the Roman world, the day's main meal is eaten in the afternoon. Like everything else, it's governed by class. The wealthy can eat in their homes. Couches are arranged around a low table. Family members recline with their invited guests, and it can be an elaborate, luxurious business. In this world, it's a key social activity. For the people lower down the scale, it's different. They don't have kitchens or a space to eat. From the sheer number of taverns and diners in the town, it looks as if for many, the norm is to eat out.
So here we find ourselves in one of the other restaurants that we've been excavating in this town block. As customers would have come up through this long passageway, they would reach the end of the property where they would find, out on the left-hand side here, 2 dining rooms. In the second one here, if we enter in, what you could expect to have found in 79 AD was a few couches around the side and the back walls. And also very simple, very basic wall decoration. Nothing like the fancy kinds of decoration we find in the much better appointed restaurants. What we've also found in this area are many of these gaming pieces with this kind of a heads and a tails feature to it. These are fantastic reminders that not only eating and drinking was important in this establishment, but also gambling as well.
The archaeologists working here have pieced together what was on the menu. They've taken the garbage and the waste that was trapped 2,000 years ago in the drains of this building and sifted through it. They add water and force air bubbles through. The fragments which float to the surface are then removed for analysis.
Here we've got some little seeds that we've picked out through the flotation. Got an apple seed in here. So we know that they're eating a wide variety of apples, fruit, different kinds of fruit like pears and figs. A lot of grape seeds, there's a lot of grape in the diet, so those are very common. Fish, a lot of fish bones, fish scale.
In fact, even the lower class citizens have access to a wide range of foods. They're benefiting directly from the power of the Roman Empire, vast trade networks that brought in goods from thousands of miles away.
For example, we found one restaurant here that had a drain that was full of a really varied diet. It had everything from small young mammals like young piglets, sheep, even dormice, a real delicacy in the Roman world.
So the people of Pompeii eat well. But this is also a special day.
Oddly enough, the very night before the eruption, out here would have been the festival of the Vulcanalia. This is a festival to appease the god Vulcan.
Vulcan is the god of fire. Fire as the force which brings warmth and light into every Roman life. He's the blacksmith god, the patron of metalworkers, like Garacinus. Roman poets imagine volcanoes as the chimneys above his workshop, and so he gives them their name. Vulcan is also a god of destruction.
Vulcan was the god of fire and earthquake and volcanoes, and so what you could imagine out here would have been a series of bonfires into which were thrown live sacrifices of fish. This is all designed to appease the volcano. Of course, the great irony is the very next day, Vesuvius completely obliterated the entire city here.
Many of these people have only hours left. As millions of tons of molten rock begin to push the mountain apart, so Pompeii begins its last night. The name Pompeii will forever be linked with two things: disaster and decadence. This city has been portrayed time and again as a place of sexual freedom, even debauchery. There is some truth in the idea. The archaeologists who came here in the 19th century were scandalized by what they found. This is the house of a wealthy banker, a former slave, made good.
It's here that we have the evidence for an amazing removal. It's the removal of a beautiful painting found by the excavator in 1875 and promptly cut from the wall and removed to the museum in Naples.
Dozens of pieces considered too explicit for public display were forcibly removed. For much of the last century, this collection's been off-limits to the public. And as late as the 1980s, women weren't allowed to see some of its contents. It's called the Secret Cabinet. This is where the banker's painting now hangs. But it hung in the banker's house for one purpose only. It was to be displayed. It took pride of place between a dining room and a bedroom. Guests were meant to see it, and see their host as a man of taste and refinement. Sexual imagery wasn't only to be found in fine art. You'd be exposed to it simply walking down the street.
Here we find a representation that's almost everywhere in Pompeii, and it is the phallus. When excavators first found it, they thought that it meant that this was a house of prostitution, or more implausibly, that it pointed the way to a house of prostitution. But in fact, this particular establishment is, of all things, a bakery. And this bakery used the symbol of the phallus, like many businesses at Pompeii, to signal good fortune and to bring prosperity to the business, perhaps even to make the bread rise.
What is clear is that explicit images were also used with the simple intention of selling sex. In a narrow side street is a building that was once a dedicated brothel. It's still one of the site's biggest tourist attractions.
A pretty startling aspect of this space is that when you look inside these rooms, they're very unpleasant, and it's hard to imagine much more than rough and ready action going on here. Yet, when we look at the paintings in the corridor outside, they're quite luxurious. They're beautiful, in fact. The men and women are quite handsome. There are beautiful bed covers on the beds. So what we have is the artist feeding the fantasies of the customers outside, making them think about upper-class representations of sex, and of course matching that with the reality of what he would find inside.
Scratched into the walls of one of the cubicles is a remarkable informal record. It's a selection of customer reviews.
What we find in these graffiti are the names of people who came here for a quick toss with the prostitutes. In fact, we find that the amount that they paid was very little, and the graffiti tell us that as well. I paid 2 asses. That's pretty cheap, because you could get a cup of common wine for 2 to 4 asses. The most expensive one, in fact, was probably 16 asses, or a denarius, and that would be a very special slave. And I say slave because what we know also from these graffiti is that the names of the prostitutes are mostly slave names.
Because it was cheap, this was a place where men from the lower classes came for sex. A richer man could keep slaves for the purpose. But across this society, there was very little embarrassment attached to seeking sex outside marriage.
There was no particular stigma attached to visiting a house of prostitution. In fact, we know this even from literary sources. We have Horace talking about the moralist Cato the Elder, who praised a young man of elite status for visiting a house of prostitution. Why? Because this saved the married women and virgins of his class from his lust.
From the graffiti, there is evidence that male prostitutes were also available.
For a Roman man, there was no shame attached to having sex with either a male or a female, as long as he was the one taking the active role.
The people of ancient Rome lived by their own set of rules. Compared to almost anywhere in the world at the time, to be free and live here is to enjoy a high standard of living. But on the 24th of August, AD 79, this life ends.
At 9 in the morning, on the 24th of August, 79 AD, the people of Pompeii could see a weak eruption column coming out of a crater like this one that was depositing a thin layer of ash on the slopes around the volcano.
Then, suddenly, at 1 o'clock, the full eruption. The explosion throws almost 1 cubic mile of rock and ash into the air. And the people of Pompeii are underneath. Some people are still inside. Some can't get out. In one rich man's house, a team of painters is trying to finish a job. For them, it's the sound and the vibration which finally tells them of the danger. They feel the earth splitting and spitting fire 27 miles into the sky. This is the moment when all normal life in Pompeii stops. When those who can, run.
So when the eruption comes, the painters are already at work, and they decide to leave in a terrific hurry. Such a hurry that one of them knocks over his bucket of plaster, spills against the central painting. So this isn't some later concretion, this is the moment the plaster hit the wall as the painters attempted to get away.
In this piece of plaster, that one moment of panic, almost 2,000 years ago, is perfectly preserved.
They leave so fast that they leave their tools behind them, and they get out.
The wind has pushed a cloud of gas and rock southeast from the mountain, directly over the city. It cools and loses energy. It falls. The painters emerge into a scene of chaos. According to ancient eyewitness accounts, some try to protect themselves by covering their heads. But the city is now being bombarded with rocks. Some are stunned, some don't survive. By late afternoon, the fallout has filled the streets and gardens to a depth of around 5 feet. Then, for those still sheltering inside their houses, there comes a new danger.
So as many of the buildings are now starting to fall down under the weight of all the volcanic debris, we can expect that our working class district with its poor architecture was one of the first to go.
People flee their wooden roofed homes, believing that sturdier stone structures will keep them safe. At the back of the restaurant owner's block is a theatre with a covered walkway.
It's at this time that many of the inhabitants are now fleeing to these public spaces, which held the promise of much greater and stronger architecture in the wake of all the debris.
24 hours ago, these people had a home, a business, a job, a comfortable life. Now they watch as what hasn't burned is buried, and they are helpless.
In fact, it was in here that the first excavators found many of the bodies of Pompeii's victims. Many, in fact, probably came from our working class district.
Most of those victims died in the next phase of the eruption. A series of pyroclastic currents, clouds superheated to over 700 degrees Celsius and traveling at up to 200 miles an hour.
The pyroclastic flows are a mixture of gas and ashes that move very fast on the slopes of the volcano. They have a very large kinetic energy, with the power to destroy anything that is in their way. The victims are hit by a wall of heat and enveloped in dense, unbreathable gas. This suffocated them at first, and then other pyroclastic flows buried the bodies. These left a deposit in this area of more than a meter of volcanic ash.
And this is how the two men, the shackled slave and his companion, meet their end. Were they trying to escape right up to the moment they died? So far, the bodies of over 1,000 individuals killed in this way have been recovered. There may be hundreds more, still buried beneath the layer of ash which blankets this entire region. So much excavation has been done here that it is easy to forget that these buildings were completely buried. Archaeologists have left this area of the city untouched, simply to illustrate the volume of material that the volcano dumped on Pompeii.
What we can observe is that this is the basic Roman ground level at 79 AD. The level was completely changed in a few hours. In fact, after the 79 AD eruption, there was an accumulation, a huge volume of volcanic materials in this area.
All'interno di quest'acqua.
The eruption lasted 3 days. Within the city walls, 7.5 million tons fell. But what this blizzard of ash, fire and stone didn't destroy, it preserved. And the city that had vanished suddenly from the map slowly slipped from memory too. Pompeii lay safe, forgotten for 1,500 years, until it was found again, purely by accident. The Roman Empire which had mourned its destruction had gone forever. But Pompeii could take on a new life. The volcano has erupted again many times, its ash falling as far away as Istanbul. But still, every year, archaeologists, historians and tourists come back. Every year, they find something new. Though excavations have yielded the finest collections ever found of Roman treasures and Roman art, they've also revealed something more precious. The life of a society long dead.